The United States did not give us anything in these treaties.
We weren't given those rights.
I see.
We retained those rights.
When they looked upon the treaties, they said, no, those aren't enforceable pieces of paper. Yet, government to government, treaties are supposed to be recognized.
We're under the belief that we're all equal in the state of Minnesota.
When the white man came over here and they took our land, they said, we'll give you this spot. Okay, well, this spot is being taken back by them.
I'm Kim Clark.
And I'm Pat Werhane.
We go out into the world to look at everything.
Topics such as food deserts, wage theft, and recidivism in jails.
Access to healthcare, education, welfare, major issues we face at home and around the world today.
Come search with us for answers to these issues and more
as we discovered new answers to today's big questions. The rights of Indigenous people is a difficult subject to talk about around the world today.
A fierce debate has developed over the fishing rights of the indigenous populations in the state of Minnesota.
The state of Minnesota and the Anishinaabe people disagree over the ability to hunt, gather, and fish.
And these rights are essential to this tribe. Without them, they will lose their traditional ways of living.
We often get this argument thrown at us that, well, the treaties are so old, they really aren't applicable today. Oh, they aren't. Well, what about our U.S. Constitution? What about the Bill of Rights? What about all of those laws that are much, much older than the treaties?
When they looked upon the treaties, they said, no, those aren't enforceable pieces of paper. Yet, government to government, treaties are supposed to be recognized. When those chiefs sat down so many years ago and said, but we want the right to hunt and to fish, to trap, to gather wild rice, to gather berries, when we want that reserved for our people, for all time. And these guys had signed okay, said, okay, we'll do that.
Some of these treaties give your people rights to hunt and fish and gather, and there's an exchange for that I wouldn't enjoy, for example. And that gives you special privileges. I'm sure you get more than most people then.
Well, and Kim, what I would say is, what you were saying is how most people perceive it.
Yes.
We weren't given those rights.
I see.
We retained those rights.
Yes.
And we gave others rights to come in and move in and things like that.
The United States did not give us anything in these treaties. What we have, whether it be hunting, fishing, gathering rights, mineral rights, airspace rights, there's a bunch of different things that all come into play here. We have because we reserved those things for ourselves, okay? Those chiefs, those headmen who were at the table with the negotiators at the time understood that perhaps these reservations that we had reserved, these land bases that we had reserved for ourselves, may not necessarily be adequate for time immemorial to supply the needs of all of the people who would be members of that tribe, of that nation. That is why they reserved these off-reservation hunting, fishing, and gathering rights. It's no different than anybody else would do in terms of assuring their survival. It's like the Indian Walmart,
So what is the issue? You have some issues now, or is everything just fine?
No, we have several issues. Really, poverty is the bottom line of our issue.
Yes.
And if we were able to go out and hunt, fish, and gather in the way that we always were, we would be able to sustain ourselves much easier. We'd have more healthy diets. And I think we'd actually be more progressive in our environment and in the community. When you're trying to overcome poverty, you have such poor choices to pick from that you never really solve any of them.
One of the really important issues in this case is that the Ojibwe want to hunt, fish, and gather all year round. That's their traditional way of life, and frankly, it's the way they survive.
And we talk about fishing and hunting and gathering. Well, we talk about fishing and hunting as a sport and something you do with a season that has a beginning day and an ending day. And the Ojibwe really use this food to eat. And they go out and hunt, and tomorrow it's dinner on the table.
But the state of Minnesota wants them to do this only during the season. And that's because, of course, for the state of Minnesota, hunting and fishing are multi-billion-dollar industries, bringing in tourists from all around the world.
Absolutely, and in this case, it's a way of life versus a way of profit.
So fish everywhere across the United States seems to be a problem between Indians and non-Indians. That's the one resource, I mean, unless you go into oil or water or something out west. So it's really kind of a weird deal. The state of Minnesota would rather pay the tribal members $15 million every 2 years to not go out and take more than 6 walleye or 3 northern at any time that they go out, so that we are kind of fitting it into their natural resource regulatory scheme. Whereas if we wanted to go out and get 200 walleye and maybe sell some to put some gas in the tank or something like that, that destabilizes things in their mind.
The state of Minnesota, under Public Law 280, currently doesn't recognize the Anishinaabes' right to freely fish on and off the reservation. The state argues that because the rights were not mentioned in the Treaty of 1855, they are no longer a part of the agreement between the tribe and the federal government.
The 54 has the words hunt, fish, and gather in it. The 55 doesn't. But those treaties were conducted within about 3 months of each other, and they involve the same signatories. So how would you convince the Indians that are supposedly in the 54 and 55 territory that, oh, you just let those guys in the 54 have hunting, fishing, and gathering and get the money for this, and you'll move over here to this 13 million acres, but you don't get to hunt, fish, and gather for the rest of your life. The rest of your life's going to be about 2 months, because you're not going to get to hunt, fish, and gather. You just get to live there. There's no deal like that. Indians ain't making no deal like that. Especially the same parties. They're going to say, you made this other deal with these guys, you're giving them money, and they get to hunt, fish, and gather, and we don't? It's nonsense. One of the things that I argue is that if the state of Minnesota, and they will have to recognize our rights to hunt, fish, and gather, because what it comes down to is what we call the reserved rights doctrine. The reserved rights doctrine in treaties and in contracts and all basically means that if I'm up here talking about selling this bottle of water, and someone buys this bottle of water and they come up to get the bottle of water, they don't get the remote control too because it was sitting beside it. We didn't talk about the remote control, you didn't ask about the remote control, and I didn't say you could have the remote control. So in 1855, they never asked about hunting, they never said anything about hunting, we never said anything about hunting, you didn't ask us for hunting, we didn't give up hunting, fishing, and gathering, and that's what it comes down to.
Recently, members of the White Earth Reservation asserted what they believed to be their treaty-given rights to fish, even though local laws prohibited the practice. Literally, they fished one day before Minnesota's fishing season opened. This is only one of numerous battles they currently have with the state.
Can you tell us more about the square hook issue?
Square hook is what the federal agents for the Fish and Wildlife Service have called the prosecution against tribal members on Leech Lake and White Earth and Red Lake reservations. And the term square hook is really, the square is really at an angle, it's a diamond, it's like a gill net. And that's what they mean by square.
And so what is the issue, that they shouldn't be fishing with a square hook?
Well, the issue is they believe that we are not allowed to hunt, well, in this case, fish commercially walleye and then sell them to other people, even tribal members. And that's really based on an agreement with the state, not with the federal government. And so we don't even believe it really applies to what's going on, and that the federal government is actually prosecuting against our treaty rights. And so we believe that this is an opportunity for our treaty rights to actually be shown to exist. And the feds may actually regret doing what they're doing at this point in time.
What do you say to you out there? He just started pulling my net, and then he took his knife and he cut it. Jesus. Give me the net. I said, no, it's my net. I got a treaty right. And he took his knife and he cut my net. We were born with this right. Under the 1855 treaty rights, when the white man came over here and they took our land, they said, we'll give you this spot. Okay, well, this spot is being taken back by them.
But not everybody agrees with the treaty rights.
We're under the belief that we're all equal in the state of Minnesota, and everyone should be able to use the natural resources under the guidelines set forth by the Department of Natural Resources. You know, whether you agree with their policies or not, but in order to manage your natural resources, you have to have limits, you have to have seasons, you have to have everything so that you can balance everything out. And we just felt that that was not the case.
If you're found netting right now in the state of Minnesota, it's a $3,000 fine and a year up to jail. It's extremely emotional and heartfelt for the community because 1855 is not illegal. 1855 has always been here, and it's not a right. It was already something that was negotiated with the U.S. government.
We want the federal government to step in and recognize that they did sign a treaty with the Native American people and our grandfathers and their fathers. You know, before that, you know, that we ceded 13 million acres of land to retain these rights.
According to the Anishinaabe, their right to hunt, fish, and gather includes environmental protection. They are currently fighting to protect the wild rice crops on the reservation that have been the nutritional backbone of their ecosystem for generations.
Our organization, Save Our Rice Alliance, people often ask me, what are you saving it from? And really it's kind of people, and both not appreciating or valuing what wild rice is as a resource up here, and also just the unintended aspects of people interacting. Right now in northern Minnesota, most of the large deep water fish lakes are pretty well developed, unless there's restrictions or public land on it. So housing is turning. Second homes are being built on these shallower lakes, a lot of them with wild rice. And of course the first thing that happens is you build a cabin, you want to be able to use it. Can I get a permit to remove the wild rice? The Ojibwe were told, if you don't go out and utilize this resource, it will be gone.
This long stick would be the pole where you would stand up in the back of the canoe and pull the canoe around while somebody else knocked in the rice. So you're out in a giant field out in a canoe, keeping your balance while you're knocking food in. The ingenious part about this harvesting method is those flailing sticks, knockers, when you use them, because of the way the grains come off, they call it a shattering characteristic. And while maybe 2/3 of the grain go right into the bottom of the canoe, the other third just explode and they reseed. And so as you harvest, you're reseeding. You know, so it's pretty slick stuff, or real simple, one of the two.
The Minoman, the wild rice is in fact a gift to the people from the Creator. Now, as you might surmise, that caused quite a concern because there was a reaction saying, well, from the standpoint of science, we can't deal with issues of spirituality where they impact something like this. We have to deal only with the pure science with these kinds of issues. And our standpoint was, well, you know, you've kind of enjoyed that privileged position for any number of years. And any time that we've needed to bring this up, we run into the same argument. You presume that you have the right to rule over all and decide and set the parameters for any discussion. Well, that time's over.
If this is a treaty and it's a contract between our nation or a portion of our nation or whatever it is, and the United States, and a member of the United States, which is the state of Minnesota, which is like a child of the parent being the United States, the state of Minnesota being the child. Well, if that child is violating the United States side of our contract, doesn't it behoove us, rather than spank that child, to go to that parent, say, we have this treaty, this understanding, this contract, this agreement, and your child is doing this, and I expect you, parent, to spank your child. I think we should be asking the federal government to force the state of Minnesota to honor that treaty and let us exercise our rights.
Our original goal was to get the state to think that we're going to go out and do this and to pay attention and look at it seriously. The federal government and the Congress and other people are looking and listening. Treaty rights are really simple for me. For me, the concept of hunt, fish, and gather is really food, clothing, and shelter. And the new canoe is the automobile. And so if you're allowed to hunt, fish, and gather in the ceded territory, to me, that means we should be able to go into an off-reservation town and have a job and come back at night and not have to pay any tax.
Sure.
You know? That's how I look at this stuff. The less money we are taxed, the more we're going to spend in our adjacent communities. And we live in a rural area. That's important for everybody. When people don't understand why we're not successful, it's because we don't have our resources. We don't even get paid what we're supposed to have had. I was talking to a friend of mine the other day, Keith Secola, he's an Indian musician and singer. And we were talking about treaty rights, and he said, those are just receipts for stolen lands and broken promises. You know? But they mean a lot more, but that is kind of a simple analysis too.
The relationship between the United States, the state of Minnesota, and its indigenous populations is subject to a web of relationships and agreements some centuries old, and the interpretation of these agreements is often to the disadvantage of the native people themselves. And that in turn leads to poverty and often even a dispersal of some of the tribes.
Where I live, there are people getting by on $4,000 or $5,000 a year. There are many people living in one place, you know, things like that, multiple generations. We call ourselves Anishinaabe, but all of our treaties refer to us as the Chippewa.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Right, and that's why it gets confusing sometimes. And one of the things that's different about us than most all the other tribes is we have 44 treaties with the United States.
No, you could only have one treaty with the government.
And that's what makes us different. And that's why it confuses a lot of people. Our treaties go all the way from Michigan all the way over to North Dakota.
So you're the Chippewa called the Anishinaabe, and your treaty that you have is really 44 arrangements with the government.
44 treaties.
44
Right.
treaties.
A lot of people, when they've learned about treaty rights, they look at one or two treaties for a group. We have 44 treaties, and some of our stuff goes back to 1825 and 1826 in Michigan when it was signed, in real Michigan, you know? And so people don't think about those kinds of rights having an effect that far away.
All these treaties are still legitimate, believe it or not.
See, that's the part I couldn't believe. The idea that they didn't undo the tangled web they started.
We've never undone any of these treaties. We just forgot about them.
Right. So it's the legal threat of forgetting. I'll forget you to death.
Well, Frank, can you tell us, I mean, many of these treaties are really old, a couple of hundred years old. How do they apply in 2013?
Well, I'll tell you a little story about how law enforcement works on the reservation in Minnesota. They call it Public Law 280, and because there were so many Indians in Minnesota, the state wanted to have control over us, and so they were given criminal jurisdiction. But they weren't given civil regulatory. And so while they can stop us for criminal conduct and try us, they can't do civil. And I figured out in law school that when they were doing civil forfeiture against tribal members on the reservation, that it sounded like it was defying the law. And so I had argued that in law school, and they told me I was wrong, but when I got out and started going to court, they started returning cars to me. And eventually I did have a case that they ruled against me, and I went to the appellate court and I got a precedent set. Now, if you go to court for DUI, you're out one night and you've got a lot of problems and you're out drinking and you get caught driving, your fine is going to be probably $1,000. Now, do you take $1,000 out of $4,000 annual income? That's 3 months' income from your family? You know, what kind of devastation does that fine create? And here locally, I think, again, people understand that a little bit more. Interestingly enough, the system itself has also changed because of the economics and of the world economy, where people who used to not pay their fine on time, they would have what they call a bench warrant. If you get stopped, they'd say, oh, there's a bench warrant, you haven't paid your fine, we'll have to call you in and make you sit in jail, and the judge comes in on Monday, you can explain to him how you're going to straighten that out. Well, that costs money. It takes time. They've decided that they don't want to do that anymore because it probably costs $200 to do that operation and $60 a night to keep somebody around. And they might only owe $100. And so now they have a debt collector. and they're going to ruin your credit. Well, most of us don't have any credit here on the res. If you're making $4,000, you don't have a credit card. A girl that I know, and I call her a girl because she's like 30, she has several kids, and she lives in poverty on White Earth Reservation. And she cannot keep a driver's license because you get stopped often enough, you get too many points or whatever, you can't keep a license. But because White Earth is bigger than the county that she lives in, and all of Monoman County is in there, she drives to work in a car that has no insurance and has no tabs, and the police stop her, but they can't take the car, and they don't know what to do about it because she's on her way to work, trying to take care of her kids. And they have to send the ticket to tribal court, and we would never take the car from somebody in poverty. And so next week when mom's going to work, she's going with no driver's license, and those were what treaty rights do.
Wow.
Whether it's a $400 car or a $10,000 car, it's entirely possible that in that household there could be 10 people living there. There could be 4 people dependent on that vehicle just to go to work. When you disrupt that, those people may lose their employment. If they lose their employment, they may lose their housing. You lose your housing, well, then you're neglectful for your kids, and they take your kids away because you don't have a house for your kids. All because a car was taken for some stupid incident. They don't understand cause and effect. They understand control, and they think that we'll respond like the other people they punish. But we have different rights and a different way of looking at life.
Almost no one in the Senate or House of Representatives, either in the state of Minnesota or at the U.S. government, knows all about these treaties.
And he's taken
and in
the
fact,
time.
the Department of Interior doesn't either.
And he became the de facto expert by getting in the car every day and driving to the records estate and really pulling a book off the shelf and reading them. And no one has taken the time to do that. He's become the guy because no one else really took the time to care. And this is one of those instances where caring makes you one step up over everybody else.
He's passionate about his clients, but he actually knows what he's talking about too. So he's a formidable foe for the state of Minnesota.
In Minnesota, more recently, we have a number of tribal members who have been arrested or charged, I guess. I don't know if arrested is the right word, but they've been charged and indicted in federal court for what they call the Lacey Act. And that's when you're involved with what they would call illegal harvest, transportation, and sale of fish. Now, for us, that would be another method of bartering, you know, whether it's wild rice or whatever, maple syrup, it's just another activity to gain money. And back in the 80s, the court started to recognize that our right to hunt, fish, and gather is we have a right to earn a modest living. So what I call our rights, because they call them hunt, fish, and gather, because in the 1800s those were the words. It's really food, clothing, and shelter. That's all it really is. Because everything that you hunt, fish, and gathered, you made all your food, clothing, and shelter out of. And those were just the words that were used.
Do you find people, the tribe members coming back to be on the reservation, or is it?
They would like to, but there's not always full employment for everybody. And so really the trick would be education, but when you get education, most of those facilities are off reservation, and by the time you spend 2 or 4 years and get a degree, you might have some student loans, you got to find a job. And if there isn't a job on the reservation when you first get out of school, chances are you're going to move to a larger urban area, which is not a reservation. And then you're going to plug into that economy and you're going to get used to that income. You might find somebody, you get married, have some kids, you need more money. You're not going to be able to move back to the reservation.
Yeah. We were talking about the fact that there's not anybody stepping up behind you to become the next attorney.
Yes.
Right. It costs too much. You know, it's $100,000 to get a legal education.
Yeah.
And if you get that, then ideally you're supposed to be paying it back.
Right.
And so you got to go out and earn more than that. And in a sense, you actually have to tell people, pay me $200 an hour to solve your problem so I can pay my student loan. And that doesn't fit in the world where I live.
As we talked to you, one of the things that struck me, and I talked to you about that before, is that the worldview of the Indian before, of course, the white people came and tried to change that, was a different view of land and territory. If I understand right, that the territory belonged to everyone and that everybody used a bit of it. And we imported from the Anglo-Saxon thinking of property. This is my property, that's your property, that's your property.
Oh.
Those are lines and property rights. And
So we brought a different set of values altogether.
so the property right, I mean, now you're talking as if those are property rights, but that's a new kind of, is that a new kind of language?
It is, and And it's the words that you have to use for the non-Indian, because non-Indians understand property. Treaties really are the rights, and they are a property right. It means we possess something.
Yes.
And even though the land has been severed from us, we still have the right to hunt, fish, and gather on those lands. And so it is a property right. And what I tell people is, instead of having it recorded at the county recorder's office, our property rights are recorded at the big house at the Capitol. They're called federal statutes. And the Congress says that treaties are the supreme law of the land. One of the last maps I saw of Leech Lake Reservation here, in 1916, before they did all the allotments, they had that same lake, that Leech Lake, it's kind of like a hand with the fingers on it and stuff. And the whole land was squares. And when it came to the shore, they'd have a little square and a little square all along the shoreline. And I'm thinking, do you think the Indians thought about this 100 years ago when they were making deals that, oh, this little square right here has got your name on it, this little square has your name on it, and that's where you get to live now. They thought they were just nomadic, and some other people were moving in and they were going to be left alone, but it isn't what happened.
This is the story of one group of people, of one indigenous population, but it's representative of indigenous populations all around the world. Often there are struggles between these populations and the countries in which they live, and these struggles do not always have a happy ending.
Indigenous populations don't have a growing public voice, which makes stating their case very, very difficult. Often their issues are really swept under the rug.
And worse, often bystanders like us don't realize the importance of these age-old agreements, but they're very important to the Ojibwe people, and they should be important to us as well.
We got